I swear that bridge never truly felt solid beneath my feet, not even that first time I dared to step onto its weathered planks. It always swayed, even on a windless day, with a silent, unsettling rhythm, like a sleeping giant about to sigh. Oakhaven, my home for the past 15 years, was a quaint little village, the kind where everyone knew your business before you'd even had your morning cuppa. Its charm lay in its predictability, the gentle hum of everyday life. Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning dahlias, the incessant clatter from the blacksmith's forge, the murmur of gossip that drifted from the pub on a Friday night. I enjoyed my quiet routine, my solitary walks along the familiar paths that snaked through the rolling English countryside, past ancient oaks and hedgerows bursting with wildflowers. It was a perfectly ordinary existence, comfortably unremarkable, but there was always the bridge. It lay tucked away, almost hidden, at the edge of the village, spanning a dry, forgotten riverbed, or rather, it should have been forgotten. It was an ancient structure, built of heavy, dark oak and rough-hewn stone, now largely consumed by ivy and moss. Its timber planks were gnarled and splintered, protesting with every footstep. It led from the familiar village side to what was now just a dense thicket of brambles and overgrown woodland, seemingly going nowhere of any importance. Yet it always caught my eye, a persistent shadow at the periphery of Oakhaven's otherwise bright and bustling picture. The villagers, though, had a strange way of dealing with it. They never spoke of it. When I tried to bring it up, a casual remark about its age or its peculiar placement, conversations would invariably veer off course, a sudden fascination with the weather or the price of turnips. There was a collective blind spot, a subtle, almost imperceptible avoidance that was far more unnerving than outright fear. It was as if their minds simply skipped over it, like a faulty record player. It was an anomaly, a blot on the otherwise pristine canvas of their collective memory. My first deliberate crossing was born of pure, unadulterated curiosity, a stubborn refusal to let something so physically imposing simply exist without acknowledgement. One blustery autumn afternoon, with a brewing storm darkening the skies, I decided to walk down to it. The air grew still as I approached, the usual chirping of birds replaced by a profound silence that pressed in on my ears. The bridge loomed, a skeletal hand reaching across an abyss. The wood groaned under my weight, a low, sorrowful sound that seemed to emanate from within the structure itself. With each step, the world around me seemed to blur at the edges, the familiar landscape of Oakhaven receding as if viewed through a distorting pane of glass. It wasn't dizziness, but a subtle disorientation, like stepping onto a different current in a river. The scent of damp earth and river water inexplicably filled the air, despite the riverbed below being parched and cracked for decades. I reached the other side, the brambles scratching at my trousers, and looked back. Oakhaven seemed distant, a postcard view, yet eerily unchanged. Returning was stranger. The planks felt colder, slicker, despite the dry autumn air. A peculiar quiet had settled over the village as I walked back through its lanes. Mrs. Henderson was still tending her dahlias, Mr. Davies was still hammering away at his forge, but when I stopped by the bakery for a loaf of sourdough, Mrs. Gable, usually so effusive, gave me a look that was almost vacant. I mentioned my walk. "Fancy exploring a bit today. Went over that old bridge by the woods." Her smile faltered. "Bridge, dear. The old crossing was demolished years ago, when they diverted the river after the big flood. Don't you remember?" My stomach lurched. "No, the other one, the ancient wooden one that still stands." She blinked, her gaze sliding past me, a faint frown creasing her brow. "There's no other bridge, love. You must be mistaken. Perhaps you dreamt it." It was then I felt it, the first tremor of genuine unease, the inexplicable event that tore at the fabric of my logical mind. The silence from the blacksmith's forge seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and for a split second I caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure at the far end of the bridge, just before a thick mist seemed to swallow it whole. It was too far to be distinct, too ephemeral to be real, yet it clung to my mind. It was as if the village itself had conspired to forget, and now my own memories were being called into question. You'd believe me, wouldn't you, if I told you about a place everyone seems to forget the moment they leave it? This wasn't just an old bridge. It was a void in the collective consciousness, and I had just stepped right into it. The bread felt heavy in my hand, no longer a comforting weight, but a reminder of how tangible my experience had been, and how easily it had been erased from the world around me. The thought that I could be so easily dismissed, my experience negated by a collective shrug of the mind, was more unsettling than any ghost story. It was a direct affront to my own sense of reality, a gnawing uncertainty that began to fester. The silence in Mrs. Gable's bakery, usually filled with the comforting smell of yeast and friendly chatter, felt suddenly vast and empty, mirroring the sudden emptiness in the village's recollection. My walk back home was a blur, my mind racing, trying to reconcile what I knew I had seen and done with what I was being told, firmly and without malice, simply wasn't true. The bridge now wasn't just a curiosity, it was a challenge, a silent defiance to the very nature of truth. Its presence was a constant whisper in my thoughts, even when I tried to distract myself with the banalities of Oakhaven life. The sun, setting over the familiar rooftops, cast long, unsettling shadows, and the world I thought I knew felt suddenly, frighteningly unfamiliar. The initial denial from villagers, once a curiosity, now began to escalate into something more sinister, a quiet, almost menacing refusal to acknowledge the truth. I tried again, cautiously, with old Mr. Finch at the pub, a man whose memory was as sharp as his wit usually. "Remember that old bridge, Mr. Finch, the one by the woods?" He took a long drag from his pint, his eyes clouding over. "Bridge? Ah, the old Roman one, you mean. Been gone for centuries, that. Good riddance, too, always flooding," I clarified, describing the exact bridge, its wooden planks, the overgrown path. He simply shook his head, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips. "No such thing, lad. Been living here all my life, would know if there was." It wasn't hostile, merely absolute. Their collective amnesia was a wall, smooth and impenetrable. My resolve to understand grew, hardening with each dismissive glance and each vacant stare. This wasn't just about an old structure, it was about the very nature of reality and my place within it. I couldn't simply dismiss my own experiences. The thought that I might be going mad, that my own mind was playing tricks on me, was more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. I had to know. My investigation began in earnest. I started with the obvious, the local archives, tucked away in a dusty corner of the old village hall, rows of yellowed ledgers, maps, and council minutes. I spent days poring over them, my fingers smudged with ancient dust. Nothing. No mention of the bridge's construction, no records of its demolition, no budget allocations for maintenance. It was as if the structure simply did not exist on paper. This lack of information was profoundly unsettling. How could something so physically imposing leave no trace? I expanded my search to the nearest town, Littleford, which boasted a larger public library and a regional historical society. The librarian, a kindly woman named Agnes, was initially helpful, but even she seemed to draw a blank on anything matching my description. Old maps showed the riverbed, but no bridge, only a dotted line indicating a potential crossing that was never built, or a planned demolition of something that was never formally recorded as existing. It was a void, a phantom limb on the landscape. Then during one particularly frustrating afternoon, burrowing through a collection of obscure local folklore pamphlets, I stumbled upon a brittle, undated leaflet titled "Whispers of Oakhaven's Forgotten Paths." It contained a brief, almost poetic entry about a whispering bridge where time folds back upon itself and memories, like fallen leaves, are swept away by an unseen current. It spoke of travelers losing their way or returning home to find familiar faces looking at them with unfamiliar eyes. It was attributed to an anonymous local chronicler. I felt a rush of vindication. Aha, I thought, a local superstition. This was it. I rationalized it, explaining it away as a cultural quirk, a local myth born to explain away historical floods, or perhaps a particularly confusing network of ancient pathways. It wasn't supernatural. It was psychological, a collective delusion, a story passed down to account for something mundane that had simply become muddled over generations. A perfectly rational, if unusual, explanation for the villagers' strange behavior. I felt a surge of triumph, a false sense of security settling over me. I believed I had understood, or at least controlled the situation by framing it within the bounds of a logical, albeit forgotten, local tradition. I was on the right track. I was solving the puzzle. This was a human phenomenon, not a spectral one. The air in the library, once oppressive, now felt lighter, almost triumphant. As I closed the pamphlet, feeling rather chuffed with myself, my eyes caught something else in the margin of an old, bound volume of land deeds from the late 19th century. It was a crude, almost childlike drawing of a bridge, eerily similar to my bridge, its distinctive arch and rickety railings clearly depicted. There was no accompanying text, just the drawing, tucked away amongst some illegible scribbles. I squinted, trying to make out more detail, and for a split second in my peripheral vision, the drawing seemed to shimmer, the lines shifting as if animated. I rubbed my eyes, dismissed it as eye strain from hours of staring at fine print. It was a micro-trigger, a fleeting moment of unease, quickly suppressed by my newfound rationalization. I was so close to understanding, to putting this unsettling mystery to bed. I wanted to believe it was a natural explanation. I wanted to believe I wasn't losing my mind. The world felt like it was tilting, and this rationalization, however thin, was the only thing keeping me from falling. I carefully copied the drawing, the paper feeling oddly rough beneath my fingertips, as if it resisted being touched. I tried to ground myself, returning to my cottage, making a proper cup of tea, and attempting to settle back into the quiet rhythm of Oakhaven. But the bridge was always there, a persistent shadow at the edge of my mind, a subtle hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. Even with my explanation, the uneasy feeling persisted. The villagers' smiles seemed a little too fixed, their eyes a little too blank when I tried to steer conversations, however subtly, back to the subject. It wasn't just a superstition. There was something deeper, something far more personal at play. My newfound sense of security, built on a shaky foundation of old folklore, began to crumble around the edges. The drawing of the bridge seemed to stare up at me from my desk, a silent, insistent presence, mocking my attempts at rationalization. The air in my cottage, usually so comforting, felt thin, charged with an unspoken question. I had tried to control the narrative, but the narrative itself was beginning to assert its own darker will. The very act of trying to understand it felt like I was being pulled deeper into its unspoken story. The sound of the wind rattling my window panes that night felt like a whisper, a distant ancient voice calling my name from across the invisible river. My logical explanation, that flimsy shield of folklore, began to crumble as new, stranger events occurred with unnerving regularity. I saw Mr. Davies, the blacksmith, walking across the bridge one morning, his head down, deep in thought. I called out to him, "Morning, Mr. Davies, off for a wander over the bridge?" He looked up, startled, his eyes wide. "Bridge? What bridge, lad?" "Just out for a bit of air, I am." He genuinely seemed bewildered, his face a mask of confusion. This wasn't just denial, it was a complete erasure. More people, whom I distinctly remembered seeing near or on the bridge, would later deny having been there, their memories wiped clean as if by an unseen hand. It was as if the bridge itself was actively manipulating their perception, or perhaps mine. The unsettling feeling that I was either losing my grip on reality or that reality itself was fracturing around me grew stronger. The ground beneath my feet felt less solid, the air thinner, as if I was perpetually on the verge of falling. It was during one of these increasingly desperate searches for answers that I stumbled upon it, a small leather-bound journal, tucked away in a forgotten dust-laden corner of the Oakhaven Library's rare book section. It wasn't catalogued properly, almost as if it had been intentionally overlooked. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was elegant, precise. The name inscribed on the first page, in a delicate looping script, was Ilara. The entries dated from the late 19th century. Ilara, it seemed, was a former resident of Oakhaven, and her journal was a chronicle of her life, her observations, and her deepest fears. And she knew about the bridge. She called it the Woven Path, describing it with a lyrical precision that sent shivers down my spine. Her entries vividly detailed her own experiences with it, the strange temporal distortions, the unsettling feeling of moments slipping away, the fading memories of others, particularly after they'd crossed it. The Woven Path, she wrote in a trembling hand, dated 1888, does not merely connect two banks, but two states of being. Each crossing is a step into a memory unwritten, a past unmade. They forget. Oh, how they forget! The faces of my neighbours, once so dear, now hold a flicker of unfamiliarity after they return from its shadow. They speak of things that never were, and things that were they deny with a serene, terrifying conviction. It is not malice, but a profound, almost blissful ignorance. I see it in their eyes, the quiet surrender to the bridge's gentle persuasion. It asks for nothing but remembrance, yet it takes everything. She spoke of feeling isolated, of being the only one who seemed to retain her full faculties, burdened by the knowledge that the world around her was slowly unraveling, its history being rewritten with each passage across the woven path. She described the river of forgotten tears that flowed beneath it, not of water but of time and sorrow, a powerful current of lost moments and repressed pain. This was not a superstition. This was a personal account. A terrified confession. Ilara's journal was a partial revelation, changing everything I thought I knew. The bridge wasn't just causing amnesia, it was an emotional anchor, a conduit for something far deeper. Ilara suspected it was built after a terrible accident, a tragedy so profound that the community collectively wished to forget it. The bridge, she theorized, was meant to heal, to connect the two halves of a grieving community, but instead it became cursed, absorbing memories, particularly those related to grief and loss. It allowed the community to forget the pain, to move on with a serene, untroubled mind, but at a terrible, insidious cost. It erased the very event that created it. This completely shattered my previous logical assumptions. This was not folklore. This was a mechanism of psychological self-preservation, manifested through something else. I felt a cold draft, not from an open window, but from within the library itself, and heard a faint, distant whisper that sounded unnervingly like my own name, just as I read Ilara's description of a similar sensation. The leather of the journal, resting open on the table, felt unnaturally cold beneath my trembling fingers, as if the sorrow trapped within its pages was seeping into my very being. The air in the usually silent library seemed to hum with unseen energy, a chorus of forgotten voices that only I could perceive. The pages seemed to glow faintly, almost pulsing with a life of their own, each word a testament to a truth long buried. Ilara's journal entries resonated with a profound, almost visceral familiarity, especially her struggle with selective memory and the village's quiet, unnerving acceptance of forgetting. Her words, so elegant yet so full of a crushing loneliness, painted a picture of a community living a carefully constructed lie, a peace built on erased pain. How could they live like that, I wondered. But then a deeper, more unsettling question began to form. What if I was no different? Her descriptions of memories fading, of loved ones becoming strangers in their own pasts, pricked at a hidden anxiety within me. I started to question my own past, my own repressed memories, those convenient blanks in my childhood narrative. Was there a reason I was drawn to this bridge, this repository of forgotten grief? Why was I an outsider, the one who seemed immune to its subtle, insidious influence, or perhaps the one uniquely attuned to its frequencies? Digging deeper into Ilara's life, driven by a growing sense of premonition, I found a faded newspaper clipping tucked between the pages of her journal, almost camouflaged by time and dust. It was from the Oakhaven Gazette, dated a few years before Ilara's first journal entry about the woven path. The headline, stark in its simplicity, read, "Local child disappears near river." The article detailed the disappearance of a young girl, Isabella, Ilara's daughter, near the very river where the bridge now stood. The description of the search, the villagers' despair, was strangely vague, almost as if details were intentionally omitted, or perhaps already beginning to be forgotten even then. The date of the disappearance predated the construction of the bridge, which, according to Ilara, was built after the tragedy. But the most unsettling detail was a faint, almost erased name, scrawled in an old hand on the back of the clipping, partially obscured by a coffee stain. Wallace. Oh, my grandmother's maiden name. My stomach plummeted. This was the emotional discovery, the devastating realization that the mystery wasn't just about the bridge's physical properties or a general collective amnesia. It was about my personal, ancestral connection to this forgotten tragedy, a direct link to Ilara and her lost daughter, Isabella. The bridge wasn't merely making people forget randomly. It was a focal point for a very specific, deeply buried grief and guilt that ran through my own family line, a wound that festered beneath the serene surface of Oakhaven. The bridge's power was tied to emotional suppression, a desperate attempt by a community, and perhaps my own ancestors, to bury an unbearable truth. I, for some reason, was an anchor for its resurfacing, the unwitting vessel for a memory that refused to stay buried. Fragments of stories my grandmother had told me during my childhood, stories I had dismissed as morbid bedtime tales, a child playing by the river, a sudden silence, a desperate search, now took on a new, chilling significance. My own childhood memories of Oakhaven felt fractured, incomplete, specifically around anything involving the old riverbed or the forgotten woods beyond it. It was as if a part of my own past had been redacted, edited for my own emotional comfort, or perhaps for the collective peace of my family. I was walking past the dry riverbed, tracing the outline of what had once been a powerful, life-giving current, when a micro-trigger sent a jolt through me. For a split second I heard it, the sound of a child's laughter, bright and innocent, followed by a distinct splash, as if something heavy had fallen into water. Then, profound, absolute silence. My heart hammered against my ribs. There was no water, no child, no sound but the rustling of leaves in the trees above. I whirled around, searching frantically, but there was nothing, only the dusty riverbed stretching out, bone dry and empty. It was a phantom memory, a visceral echo of the past, now bleeding into my present. Another micro-trigger hit me later that evening as I stood looking at my own reflection in a still puddle after a sudden shower. For a terrifying moment, it wasn't my own face staring back, but a younger, sadder one, with wide, mournful eyes, framed by hair the color of autumn leaves. It was Isabella. The face faded, replaced by my own, but the image lingered, a haunting testament to the truth that was now asserting itself. What would you do if you found out your entire life was built upon a lie, a forgotten grief, and you were the only one left to remember? My connection to Oakhaven, to my family, to myself, felt irrevocably altered, a landscape reshaped by a buried river of tears. The bridge was not just a place, it was a living wound, and I, unwillingly, was now part of its painful history, its silent, persistent scream. The weight of this revelation was immense, crushing, yet it also brought a strange, horrifying clarity. The weight of this revelation was immense, crushing. Isabella, Ilara, Wallace, my own family line, woven into the tragic fabric of Oakhaven's forgotten grief. It all clicked into place with a horrifying precision. I now understood why I had been so inexplicably drawn to the bridge, this silent sentinel of sorrow. It was calling to me, to my suppressed family memory, to the lingering guilt related to Isabella's disappearance. The village's amnesia, once a perplexing phenomenon, was now clear. It was a collective coping mechanism, a quiet, unconscious agreement to forget the pain, to build their serene lives on the ashes of a buried tragedy. They had chosen peace over truth, and the bridge, in its own silent way, had facilitated that choice. But what was my role in all of this? Was I meant to be the one to unearth it all? To force the collective wound open once more? I found myself at the precipice of a profound, soul-shattering choice, the true internal conflict emerging from the shadow of the supernatural. Do I try to force the villagers to remember, to unearth the century-old grief and guilt, even if it shatters their fragile peace, their carefully constructed oblivion? Do I become the harbinger of a pain they had so desperately tried to forget? Or do I accept the burden of this knowledge myself, allowing them to remain in their contented ignorance while I alone carry the heavy truth of the forgotten? This was no longer about a mysterious bridge or supernatural occurrences. It was a deeply moral dilemma, a clash between individual truth and collective peace. It was about my responsibility to the past, to the dead, and to the living. The fear was no longer of the unknown, but of the immense, lonely responsibility of knowing. It was a choice between causing widespread anguish or bearing a solitary sorrow. I returned to the bridge, not as a curious observer, but as someone inextricably tied to its purpose, to its silent, yearning call. The air around it felt different this time, heavy and thick, almost sentient. The bridge itself seemed more present, more tangible, as if it had been waiting for me, waiting for this moment of reckoning. I could almost feel the phantom currents of Ilara's river of forgotten tears flowing beneath its desiccated planks, a powerful, invisible force pulling at my resolve. I felt the insidious temptation to let my own difficult memories, my own small regrets, my own anxieties be absorbed into its ancient wood, to find the same serene ignorance that had enveloped the villagers for generations. It would be so easy to let go, to simply forget and be forgotten by the bridge, to let it erase the burden of this inherited truth. As I stood on the bridge, the air grew heavy, pressing in on me, a tangible weight. I felt a distinct pressure, as if countless memories, a cacophony of lost moments and repressed pains, were trying to push through me, seeking release. For a moment, the world shimmered, and I saw fleeting, indistinct figures in my peripheral vision, like ghosts of forgotten townsfolk. Their faces, though blurred, seemed etched with sorrow, their gazes fixed on me, a silent plea in their eyes. I heard faint whispers, not distinct words, but a chorus of lost emotions, a sigh, a sob, a child's mournful cry, a symphony of the unspoken echoing from the depths of the bridge's heart. It was a profound micro-trigger, a direct assault on my senses, a visceral manifestation of the bridge's true nature, but I resisted. I clamped down on my own grief, on my own fears. I would not succumb. I would not allow the bridge to take what was rightfully mine, my memories, my truth, my connection to Isabella, to Ilara, to the past that now coursed through my veins. I would not let it become another mechanism for escape. My gaze fell upon a small, tarnished silver locket nestled in a crack between two ancient planks, half buried by moss. It was delicate, intricately engraved with fading wildflowers. It felt warm to the touch, despite the chill in the air. This, I knew with an unshakable certainty, was Isabella's locket, lost all those years ago, perhaps a final, tangible link to the past that the bridge had failed to completely erase. It was a symbol of what cannot be forgotten, a silent, defiant scream against the tide of oblivion. The decision solidified within me. I would not forget. I would not allow this truth to be lost again. I would be its keeper, its solitary witness. My decision solidified, clear and unwavering. I would not destroy the bridge. That would be too simple, too logical, an act of violence against a silent memorial. Instead, I performed a symbolic act, not for others but for myself, an acceptance of my role as the keeper of this forgotten truth. With the locket, Isabella's locket, clutched in my hand, I knelt on the bridge's weathered planks. I didn't place it back. That would be to return it to the silence. Instead, I carefully, deliberately carved a small, almost invisible mark onto one of the timbers near where I found the locket. A tiny I for Isabella, a silent testament to the memories it held, to the truth I would carry. It was a quiet defiance, a personal vow. As I performed this act, a wave of profound sadness washed over me, a deep ache in my chest that spoke of centuries of unresolved grief. But strangely, it was accompanied by a strange sense of clarity, a quiet peace that settled deep within my bones. I understood the bridge now, not as a malevolent curse, but as a silent memorial, a keeper of a grief that needed to be acknowledged, a wound that yearned for healing. The river of forgotten tears no longer flowed beneath the bridge, but within me now, its currents echoing through my very soul. The oppressive air around the bridge seemed to lighten, or perhaps it was just my perception, my own mind finally finding equilibrium amidst the chaos of rediscovered truth. The sense of dread, once so pervasive, was replaced by a quiet, lingering melancholy, a profound understanding of what had been lost and what had been saved. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I returned to Oakhaven. The villagers were still themselves, still oblivious to the bridge's true nature, still existing in their bubble of serene ignorance. Mrs. Henderson was still pruning her dahlias. Mr. Davies was still at his forge, the familiar rhythm of village life unbroken. They greeted me, talked about trivialities, about the upcoming village fete, about the unseasonable warmth. They didn't remember me crossing the bridge, or perhaps they never truly did. Their eyes held no flicker of recognition regarding my journey, no hint of the dark currents that now flowed through me. But I remembered. The world had not changed for them, but it had irrevocably changed for me. I was a different man, walking through the same streets, breathing the same air, but seeing a different reality. The burden was immense, a quiet weight on my shoulders, yet it was also strangely liberating. The truth, however painful, was mine to hold. Back in my cottage, later that evening, I looked out the window. The distant line of the bridge was barely visible through the twilight, a dark silhouette against the fading sky. And then, a micro-trigger. For a split second, I saw a faint shimmer, a heat haze, rising from its ancient timbers, even though it was a cold, clear evening. It was a sign that it was still there, still active, still humming with forgotten memories, a beacon for truths yet to be remembered. It was a reminder of my solitary vigil. They say ignorance is bliss, don't they? But sometimes the weight of a forgotten truth is the heaviest burden of all. What would you choose? Peace in oblivion or truth in sorrow? The choice was made. The path was clear. I had crossed more than just a bridge. The bridge may still stand, a silent sentinel over Oakhaven's forgotten grief, but I am the one who truly crossed it, and the echoes of that journey will forever whisper in my soul.